There we go. And then if you can accept the recording, that would be great. And we're going to get started. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on hybrid engagement. This is the fourth in a series that we've been doing over the past 4 months. And it is our final one on policy. For today, we're going to be going over the hybrid initiative process and sort of where we are and next steps. We're going to have some state policy updates for you today. We're going to be exploring some policy themes that we've heard over the past 3 to 4 months, as well as give you an opportunity to do some breakouts and discuss with your colleagues. So please, later in the presentation, feel free to take yourselves off camera, and we will have about 15 minutes to do a breakout where you can talk to each other, providing a little bit more interactive ways of connecting today. We'll end the session with a Q&A session with our speakers and talk about what is next. Our project partners that have been with us since the beginning, from the town of Dedham, Leon Goodwin, town manager, Sarah McDonald, the select board member, and Amanda Smith, the public information officer there. From the town of Randolph, Michelle Tyler, who's here today as well, planning director, and from the city of Framingham, Hannah Voigt, hopefully I said that correctly, the senior advisor of external affairs. They've been exploring hybrid with us over the past few months. We also have Mapc's community engagement division that have been working on this project from the beginning, and they're all here today. Some group agreements before we get started. When we do group breakouts, please use I statements. Make sure to think about taking space or making space if you've been chatting a lot. Please use accessible language, and we will also, as presenters, be trying to do the same, not trying to use as many abbreviations. Push past your comfort zone, accept and expect lack of closure. I will say this is what feels like the beginnings of all of these conversations around hybrid engagement. I don't feel like we have all the answers at all yet. So please, I think be patient with the fact that we may not have all the answers, but we're trying to collect as many questions as possible and have active participation. We hope that you can really kind of focus and be with us for the next 90 minutes. Our hybrid initiative started in June, and it is going to be ending at the end of December. We had our project kickoff over the summer with our 3 partners. We've had, like I said, a workshop on navigating engagement back in the summer. We had a large showing. We had focus groups over the spring with teachers, with academics, with cable access folks. We've had a workshop on facilitation and meeting design. And we also had a workshop in October on technology. All of these things are on our website, and you can rewatch any of the workshops or gain any notes from those sessions. Since the last workshop, we did a policy discussion with some town administrators and managers and elected officials. We also have connected with the Massachusetts Municipal Association, and we did one roundtable on the American Rescue Plan Act with municipal folks. That was a hybrid meeting. So we were practicing everything that we've learned. Today we have our workshop. We have a couple of more hybrid meetings that we're going to be practicing after today into December with Framingham, with the Dedham Master Plan. And finally, we will have an engagement toolkit that we'll be posting by the end of December. So just a quick note here, we've been talking a lot about what hybrid engagement is. And so the definition that we use is hybrid engagement is when you mix in-person engagement in a public meeting and virtual engagement. So there's a way to access, participate, provide feedback in a virtual way. When we think about hybrid engagement, it can be synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronous is what we've been focused on, but certainly there's lots to say around hybrid engagement that doesn't happen all on the same day, same time, where you can be engaging people with different virtual tools at different times. Today we have folks, experts that are going to be providing hopefully answers to your questions on state policy. So Leah Robbins from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council's Government Affairs is joining us today. Lauren Goldberg from KP Law, the managing attorney, will also be joining us today, hopefully addressing some of your pressing questions. All right, and so I'm going to turn the speaking now to Leah, who will be going over some policy updates. How did we get to where we are today? Leah, are you there?
I sure am. And Emily, can you continue sharing the slides if that's all right?
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. So thank you guys so much for having me today. I am really excited to talk policy. As a sort of overview about what we're going to talk about together, showing up on the screen, I'm not sure why it's showing up in pieces, but you can put it all up at once, Emily, is a very not to scale timeline of some of the key points in how our remote meeting policies have changed at the state level since the pandemic. So together we're going to talk a little bit about what things were like before the pandemic that address the possibility for remote participation. Then we're going to talk about some of the changes during COVID. Those are those 3 points really at the top of the timeline, and then where we are now and what might be on the horizon. So that's just kind of an overview of a little bit about what we're going to dig into. Next slide, please. So like I said, I want to start by talking about some of those provisions of the open meeting law that impact the ability to hold meetings remotely. So remote participation, as it says on the screen, we're testing everyone's eyesight today, required prior adoption by the chief executive officer of the municipality, if this is a local body. And then for a county public body, the adoption would have to be by the county commissioners, or if we're talking about a retirement board district, regional or state body, it would have to be a vote of the public body itself if they want to allow remote participation to occur. And then also allowed under the law and the attorney general regulations that are set up is that a chief executive officer can say, actually, no, there shouldn't be remote participation allowed. And then there's also a carve out for local commissions on disability that are able to permit remote participation, even if the chief executive officer hasn't signed on to allow remote participation. So they've always been sort of carved out. And then there are also some minimum requirements for what this participation can look like. And Emily, you can click ahead. It would need to include the quorum of the body, including the chair or the person chairing the meeting, has to be physically present at the meeting location. Members of the public body who want to participate remotely, and all persons participating have to be clearly audible to each other. And all votes taken during the meeting, when one of the members is remote, you have to do it on a roll call. So the top takeaways for me in this before COVID world that we were in with remote participation was that it's really about the members of the public body and how they're engaging and participating, not as much about members of the public being able to have that ability. That remote participation requires a quorum of the public body and the chair to all be physically present, and that it's only possible when physical attendance would be unreasonably difficult, right? So it's really emphasizing this goal of having people in the same room together for meetings. All right, so everyone's got that in your head. That's kind of where we were pre-COVID. It feels like so long ago. Okay, next slide. And then in those early days of COVID, when we were trying to figure out what's going on, and we needed to address social distancing and finding out a way for meetings to continue, and we weren't really sure how long this was going to go on. And some people were saying, oh, let's just hold off on meetings. And it became clear maybe we needed some urgent things to happen. So on March 10th, the governor signed the executive order initiating a state of emergency, which gave him the ability to issue executive orders. And on day 2 of that process, he issued the order around suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law. And that was going to be in effect until the state of emergency was terminated, which was like an unfathomable date and time for how long that was going to be. Great. That's a really helpful point. Public bodies are any body that is named. Oh, can you go back one slide, Emily? Sorry. Let me just talk a little bit about what was in the executive order, and I'll get to the point in the chat too as we move along. So the executive order really laid out adequate alternative means of public access. That was a phrase that was defined in the executive order. And that really said that deliberations, it said that there needed to be adequate alternative means of public access to the deliberations, and where it was required that there be participation by the public, that also be allowed remotely, right? So the access to the public was key. It also allowed that remote participation be authorized for all members of the public body. So that means that the requirement for a quorum and a chair to be in the same room was suspended. And there was this alternative option for reasons of economic hardship and despite best efforts that would allow for including a full and complete transcript afterwards. But the Attorney General's guidance that was coming out was sort of encouraging people as much as possible to allow that adequate alternative means of public access simultaneously to the meeting. All right, next slide. So we have in our head what happened with all of these public bodies, which is really most meetings of a town government or a local government or state entities. There's very few entities that are sort of carved out in the Attorney General's ruling, and I would urge you to consult there to sort of see what kinds of bodies count. But it's really sort of under the regular guidance of the Attorney General's office. They're not changing that definition of what a public body is. We also have these special kinds of meetings, and I know it doesn't impact everyone on this call because we've got cities too. But there is also this big question about what do you do with town meetings, because those are defined really separately in general law. So the first thing that happened was a law was signed that would enable town meetings for that first few months to be delayed beyond June 30th, which was a big deal because that's when the budget cutoff is. And then also on June 5th, there was this law signed that would enable reduced quorum for town meetings and the ability for you to hold your meeting outside of your municipal borders. And that was going to be in effect for the duration of the state of emergency. And then if you click ahead, Emily. For representative town meeting, and that's an even smaller segment of the pie. I think it's less than 40 communities around the state that have opted into the representative town meeting form of government. That law that was signed in June also established a very detailed process by which a representative town meeting could choose to hold their meeting remotely, including through the use of phone and video conferencing. And that also was set to last for the duration of the state of emergency. All right, so we've got in our heads now what happened for public bodies town meeting and representative town meeting, and it's all ending at the end of the state of emergency. So we go to the next slide. As everyone here remembers, Governor Baker ended the state of emergency on June 15th, 2021. So all of these issues, all of these orders that were issued and the laws that were filed they went away starting on June 15th. So on June 16th, Governor Baker signed into law Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021. It's got a nice rhythm to it. And that, and Emily, you can click through, spoke to all three of those bodies, both the meetings of the public bodies, the town meetings, and the representative town meetings, and basically said the stuff that was in those executive orders or the pieces that were in those two previous bills, continue them. And it set a date by which those would sunset. This bill also included a lot of other provisions for everything from beer and cocktail and wine sales to virtual notarization and a lot in between. But these were three things that I wanted to be sure to lift up in this conversation. We have the ability through April 1st, 2022 to hold these meetings remotely of our public bodies. And then until December 15th, the ability for town meetings to be reduced or in quorum or to be remote if you are a representative town meeting. Okay, so next slide. Great. So that was, so just to sort of like dig in, this will be very familiar. It's basically exactly what was in the executive order that we talked about just a few minutes ago. The law continues the adequate alternative means of public access to the deliberations of the public body and requires that the public have an ability to participate where it is required that they have that ability to do so. That has to be remote as well. What I think is really important to underscore is that adequate alternative means of public access is not necessarily video. It can be phone. It includes language that is expansive and sort of encourages to think beyond just one way, which I thought I always like that language that opens up some additional possibilities. It still has that language of economic hardship and despite best efforts. And it has the ability, again, for all members of the board or the body to participate remotely. So that requirement for a quorum to be in one space where the public can also gather is removed. And everything else that you know and love about the open meeting law remains in place, from postings to minutes, all that sort. Next slide. So all of what I said, I have to give a lot of credit to the Attorney General's Open Meeting Law Division. They have excellent materials that I rely on really closely when it comes to understanding what's in these complicated laws that we're passing and understanding a lot of the impacts. If you are not yet on their mailing list, I'm going to put a plug in for them. And I really just highly recommend their resources on this and so many other topics. So what's next? Go to the next slide. We've got these provisions related to town meeting ending on December 15th, and the provisions related to meetings of public bodies ending April 1st, 2022. Legislators are considering a couple of proposals that would extend those deadlines, and of course, have the ability to make further changes to those proposals. So the big caveat that I'll put in with all of this discussion about legislation is that it was filed in January of this past year, so before the emergency order was lifted. So we were kind of in a different time then. We didn't know when that order would be lifted, what the impacts would be, how things would continue to be going. So I think there's, in our conversations that we've been having as a government affairs team with legislators, a lot of interest to understand what's going on the ground and how to be responsive to the changing needs of communities. So we go to the next slide. One place that a lot of these bills went is the Joint Committee on Municipalities and Regional Government. Two of the bills, and they actually sort of moved some of these bills out for to the branches for consideration. So one bill, an act further addressing challenges to municipal governance, would address open town meetings and would allow open town meetings to also be held remotely during the course of the pandemic. And by during the course of the pandemic, I should be more clear. I mean, during the state of emergency declared by Governor Baker. So that's now under consideration by the Senate Committee on Ways and Means. That, since we're no longer under the state of emergency, there would have to be some changes to that proposal. And they also were considering a bill that would make it so that if a warrant was filed when we were still under the state of emergency, that it would, that meeting to be held remotely could still be held remotely. And that spoke to a particular municipal challenge. So they've been thinking really about town meetings and what are we going to do about those big public meetings for our communities. And next slide. Oh, yeah. The Joint Committee on State Admin and Regulatory Oversight has been really digging in on this question of meetings of public bodies and what needs to happen next. So two bills that are under their consideration that I've been really interested in. There's one bill that would update the open meeting law to require that public bodies continue to provide remote access. And then there's another bill that would enable public bodies to allow remote access by enabling remote members to count towards a quorum and allowing that that definition of adequate alternative means of participation to be remain in statute. So there's some clarity around what that looks like. So those are kinds of some of the conversations that legislators are having around those two areas of remote, around open town meeting and representative town meeting, and around our open meeting law required meetings. And from these hybrid initiative conversations, we in the government affairs team are really hearing a lot of continued interest for communities to have this ability to pursue remote participation by members of bodies and members of the public. And we're working to convey that to legislators. So what you guys are saying is really helping us craft what we're encouraging legislators to take on. We encourage you to have conversations with your legislators about this issue. It is very much pending. I will say the legislators are set to go on a bit of a recess today, and they'll come back in January, but the conversations still continue even when they're not sitting for formal session. So I will definitely drop those bill numbers in the chat, and open to, I will try to answer questions, and when I don't know the answer, I will get right back to you. Thank you guys so much.
Great, thank you so much, Leah, for really giving us the ABCs of sort of the policies that have really allowed for virtual engagement. So we're just going to take a quick moment here. I just wanted to see if there's any questions in the chat, clarifying questions for Leah, or even for Lauren, who's been listening to the presentation. Just wanted to see if anything sort of pops up here. I think people were interested in the bill numbers, Leah. So in a moment when you get a chance, we'll definitely see if we can pop some of those bills into the chat. You did distinguish between public body and regular public meetings. So Anne has a question here. I think it's important to explain that none of this is applicable to master planning meetings, transportation advisory committees, open space planning meetings, etc. Only official public boards. Did you want to add anything to that, Leah, or even Lauren?
That's a level of detail that I really appreciate, and I would have been turning to the Attorney General's office for that clarification.
And then there's a question. Yeah.
So I would say the same thing to that Leah did. At this point, I have not been asked actually previously. I'm going to take a look at the definition of public body again while we continue talking, and hopefully I can circle back to it at the end.
Excellent. There is a question here around, and I know you all have questions, very specific questions, so we'll see what we can answer today. But can you discuss the opportunities to use breakout rooms in Zoom during meetings of public bodies, and how much might that impact open meeting law? So good question.
I'll jump in while Leah figures out what she wants to say about this, but I think there are a number of issues presented by use of technology that are very difficult when trying to meet the requirements of the open meeting law as well. Breakout rooms would also need to be available to someone who joins a meeting. So, you know, I would hesitate to use breakout rooms in the open meeting law context. Most of the board and committee meetings of a particular municipality don't overlap. So you can watch one, watch the other, or attend one, attend the other. If not, and it's definitely worth asking whether you have the capability of recording and then posting those recordings onto the web so that people have an opportunity to listen to it without having to actually be there at that exact time. And I would note that I think everybody feels that, or everybody that has a computer and connection to the internet feels that more information is available because of COVID. It used to be, you know, just the open meeting notice, but now you might find the packet and, you know, the backup or links to a different page. So there are things that we're gaining for sure at the same time as we're facing these additional challenges. And I will conclude these remarks by saying, I think one of the most important things to recognize is that we've had email since everyone's had email since like 1995, everyone. And the open meeting law, it addresses it by just saying it's subject to the law, but that took a lot of years. It took till 2010. And the public records law, same thing. We have emails, we have texts, we have breakout room recordings, all sorts of things. And the law doesn't provide a clear path. You just really have to look at each case on its own to say, what are the requirements under the open meeting law? Are people able to be here if they want to? Do they know in advance? Is it posted properly? And especially if you're going to hand things out at a meeting, and I say hand things out in quotes, are you able to make those things available earlier? So we will figure out, ultimately in large part with the Attorney General making decisions on each matter. And then the rest of us kind of figuring it out. Oh, there is a decision on that and going from there. Okay, Leah, please.
That was, yeah. It was exactly very similar to what I would have said if I had enough words in my brain for that. Yes.
I will do a quick shout out to Leah, who's been up since very early and ran the MARPA conference today. So she's doing double duty. There is a great question, and I think this is the question of the day, which is, what is the likelihood that the provisions will be continued beyond April? Jill similarly was asking, for her town meeting, it starts in March. So if there's an extension, will there be enough time? So these are some of the questions that I think people are bringing today. What's your best guess?
That's definitely the question that's top of my mind. And I think the thing that we're really working towards is trying to get that clarity as early as possible. I think it's something that we certainly struggled with when the emergency order was lifted, right? If folks remember, there was that day-long gap where we didn't have the new law yet signed into place. And people weren't sure if the language is going to get in to make sure that those meetings that had been held remotely would still be considered okay under the open meeting law. So we have a track record of getting things done, but maybe a little bit close to the deadline for when it impacts. But it's definitely, I think if communities are saying to legislators that it's an issue, I think it's something that will hopefully rise to the top of the list of things that they need to tackle. And it is a big list. I just to say it's definitely a lot of things that they're working to address.
If I could, I really was focused on the part of Leah's comment where she said communities have to talk to their legislators. This is a political issue and it can only be solved by the legislature. So, and I don't mean politics, parties. I mean, it's related to what people think about access to information and availability of information kind of at a distance versus being in person in a room with all the people, and people feel very differently about that. And I think, Leah, that's part of why it took a little while to convince the legislature that not having a plan to change was really dangerous for a lot of municipalities. So what can your municipality do? You could, and this is, I think, and as well, part of what convinced them originally in March of 2020 to pass some election related matters was you could ask for a special act for your town. So that means your town meeting, your city council presents a proposed law, it's voted on, a certified copy is sent to your legislators, and they file it on your behalf. I will say I think the tendency is to think I called once, that's enough. They know where I am. I don't want to, to pester them. For this, I don't think that that's the approach that's going to work. There is an urgency to this. And for example, the March town meeting that we're talking about, I mean, the option for that town is to have to spend money to hold a special town meeting so that they can ask for a special act for that purpose, or to spend money to ask the court for a declaratory judgment that they can use that method, notwithstanding state law, because it's in a weird timing and what people expect. I have no doubt that there will be some towns that won't wait. I think if you look, we saw about maybe 10 towns or 15 towns that went to court in 2020 to get permission to do X, Y, and Z things that weren't yet addressed in the legislation. And nearly, right after all of the court work had been done and before the new fiscal year, the legislature passed something that allowed them to do that. So I think it is, and that's where I was going with political at the start of this. I think they need to hear loud and clear. I think they need to hear from managers, administrators, select board members, finance committee members, clerks, anyone who has their ear, so that they can understand the situation that towns are put in and cities are put in. And also, it really comes down to regular volunteers, regular people trying to navigate, this crazy set of rules. This is it one day, this is it the next day, how's that supposed to work? So I'm hopeful that you all can convince the legislature to provide more flexibility on that, so that you don't each have to spend, each municipality doesn't have to spend money to secure that ability for themselves.
Great. Thank you so much for your expertise and your perspectives. And we are going to continue the conversation. We have a couple of more things to present. We'll go into small breakouts, and then we have a good amount of time for more Q&A. I think there was a question on closed captioning. I believe we do not have that availability on this particular Zoom channel that we have at MAPC. I'm so sorry that we could not provide that, but the recording is happening. And so I hope that you can come back to the recording, and we will work on making sure we have closed captioning for large public meetings like this one. All right, so I did want to take an opportunity to sort of come back and present these policies, and I say policies with like capital P, lowercase p, kind of programmings. I think one thing that we always run into is when we use the word policy, it means many things to many people. And so as it relates to hybrid engagement, I want to bring up some of the things, some themes of things that we heard. Next slide. This is definitely a moment to leverage current investments. So the Commonwealth, as well as cities and towns, are seeing huge investments coming in from the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, the infrastructure bill that I think has just got signed this week, federal funds, the Build Back Better funds that might be coming in next year. So there definitely is a moment to leverage and kind of figure out how these funds can help support the engagement of community members in these public meetings or planning processes or decision-making meetings. Updates to open meeting law. I won't reiterate what Leah and Lauren said so eloquently, but in order to even continue to do hybrid engagement, we do need to have some updates passed. And so this definitely is a moment to do that advocacy or to communicate your thoughts and needs around wanting to continue to do virtual engagement, if not hybrid engagement. I do want to say something here on equitable practices. So from day one, you all have voiced how doing virtual engagement or even in-person and virtual engagement has definitely hit different equity issues and concerns. In some cases, I would say in-person engagement was inequitable before COVID, where there's people that couldn't participate for many different reasons. And by going virtual, we have seen an uptick in people being able to participate in public meetings and decision-making meetings. And so in that sense, I think the pendulum sort of swung one way to increase accessibility. But in the other way, there are many people that still don't have the tools, the resources, whether it be laptops and connection to internet, or parts of the state that are rural and don't have the connectivity or the broadband. So these are some things that we need to sort of think about and consider. The last thing I'll say on equity is someone was bringing up in the past year wanting to have more diverse committees and diverse folks participating in their cities and towns. And as you try to increase the diversity of folks participating, you also need to think about technology and making sure there's an equitable practice there. Next slide. So the other theme that we've definitely heard is around operationalizing things at this point. So some, I would say, municipalities that we spoke to, I think there was a town administrator that just said, you know, I'm kind of a customer service type of person. If people want it, that's what we'll provide. And so that was someone that is now providing hybrid meetings, just making it happen. I think there probably is a need to have cities and towns adopt a public meetings policy. You know, the question is, when should in-person meetings require a virtual option, or what meetings actually do need to be in person? And so just as Lauren was saying, this is a case-by-case basis where your city or your town thinks about your constituents and what would work best. But I guess it is sort of something to think about, is what is your policy in your city, in your town, or your organization, if you're with an organization today. Next slide. Building staff capacity. So I can't tell you how many times we've definitely heard this. In order, I think we've heard, you know, cities and town staff say, we can do in person, we've done it before, we've proven to be able to do virtual. Mixing the two is the part that gets a little sticky around capacity, for sure. I think during our past hybrid workshops, we talked about sort of facilitation and technology, but certainly building staff's capacity, whether it's their knowledge in how to use the tools and how to run hybrid meetings, or it's also mixing sort of the roles or of city and town staff on being able to have maybe different parts of their job required to do this type of work. The other thing around capacity is hiring. So one thing someone brought to our attention is that as we are now hiring new people at municipal level, it would be good to now require these skills of all new people, and also trying to do some recruitment around the workforce of folks that have these skills. Next slide. Other things that were considerations that definitely brought up to light was making technology upgrades, and not just upgrades here and there, but really making it a capital expense. As I said before, we do have some funds, lots of funds coming into the state, and trying to leverage those funds and figure out how you make those technology upgrades would be excellent. We have one city that was using sort of the theme of resilience around how they were using ARPA funds, and they have now invested in buying every staff member a laptop, so that if there's another, God forbid, public health emergency where everyone needs to sort of shut down again, or even climate emergency, people have sort of the tools, staff have the tools to keep things going, keep things running. Investment in broadband access is definitely something we've been hearing about on the state level. And I think even, was it Northampton this week, that is investing in their own broadband access. But getting more people connected is really something to be thinking about as we continue, thinking about hybrid engagement. Lastly, community trainings on virtual tools. We worked with actually Lauren and the town of Dedham on town meetings last year, and we held various trainings on how to use the tools and then how to use the tools as it relates to the rules of running a town meeting and participating in town meetings. So I think in engaging more people in trainings on how to use the tools and then how to engage with your municipality would be something to think about. The MAPC is offering digital access and equity planning. So that might be something that you might want to consider. And also there's a program called the Digital Navigators program. It's a national pilot that is something that we've also been using as a way to engage with community members, and partners in the community to be able to do this education around digital tools. Next slide. All right, so that brings me to our breakout discussion. We have about 15 minutes. We just really wanted to take a breath here, a moment to kind of hear what is your reaction to these themes or to the policy updates that Leah and Lauren gave. We kind of want to hear a little bit about what your current practices are and if there are any policies that you're thinking of implementing in your municipalities or organizations. We're going to do 6 breakouts. We'll have someone from MAPC in the room, either facilitating and note taking, and then we'll return back to close out the session with more of a question and answer portion. So I'm going to let Yolando do his magic. I think he is going to be putting us all into breakout rooms. So please accept when you are in the breakout. All right.
For the folks who are still in the room, you just have to accept the link to go to breakout rooms. Does anyone need help joining breakout rooms who are still in the main room? I see some folks still have not joined their breakout rooms. You should see a window. It might be behind the regular Zoom window. You just have to click yes to join the breakout room.
Hello, everyone. I, for some reason, thought that Yolanda was coming back to get us started, and I apologize for that. We're supposed to be talking about the themes that were discussed during the earlier part of the PowerPoint. I'll read them to you in a second. And the questions are, what is your reaction? What are your practices currently? And what kind of policies do you think, or are you thinking of implementing, or would you want to in a perfect world? So let me just get this slide back so that I can. Okay. Are you guys able to hear me? Are you able to see me? Obviously, this is a little difficult for you guys. Would you be able to raise your hand if you in fact are hearing what I'm saying? And you all have the ability to unmute yourselves. I'm happy. I'll do it for you all at the same time. So I've sent a request for you to all unmute if you are able. All right. Seeing and hearing nothing, I think I'm going to leave and go back to the general break room. I really apologize for, having this time not be used to its maximum, but I appreciate you hanging around. Thank you. Not very helpful timing. Sorry, everybody. I couldn't hear or see any of you, so I apologize.
Good. Thank you so much for everyone that had some great conversations in your breakout. I think a few of you are still coming back in. There we go. Apologies for anyone that was mid-sentence and telling us something wonderful. Please feel free to finish your thought in the chat. Thank you for those discussions. I know in our group, we had some really thoughtful conversation around making sure we're still having welcoming environments and reminding ourselves that even if we start to do hybrid meetings or continuing with virtual meetings, that you still need sort of those introductory remarks about how to use the medium and how to participate and not kind of get too comfortable and not forget that. The other conversation we had was around that if you start to actually do the hybrid meetings, that maybe over time it will become more comfortable and not feel so overwhelming. A couple of you kind of shared a little bit around trainings and also tools that have really been life-changing. There's one particular tool that gets mentioned all the time. Again, we're not promoting you go and purchase this tool, but the OWL is definitely something that we keep hearing about. For the other breakouts, was there any other things that stood out that you would like to share? So I'm going to look to MAPC facilitators here.
Hey, Emily, I can share something that one of my breakout room members mentioned right at the very end, and that was that we spent a lot of time talking about, decisions about facilitating meetings and meeting spaces, but what do you do when the staff that you're working with are in the office, but the participants are remote and the staff are all in the same room? And in order to facilitate, there's feedback from the various conversations happening because they're in a shared office space. And so figuring out policy about where people are and what computers they use and are they in conference rooms and all that stuff is definitely something that folks are trying to figure out now.
I'll add one more note about our breakout. We had a great discussion with Keith, Palma, Donna, and others about ADA accessibility and the continued struggles we've been having with interpretation and translation, making sure things are legible, readable, accessible to everybody. And how do we, again, emphasize a strong facilitator in those spaces, because making sure that people get what they need in a virtual space is super important. And then how do we set up the policies to make sure that people are supported? So an ongoing conversation there about that.
Other comments or insights from your breakouts from the MAPC facilitators?
I can chime in here, Emily. From in my breakout room, one thing that was advocated for is whatever does happen in regards to policy at the state level, that the more we communicate with the people who are implementing it at the local level and communicate with them early is definitely key. So they're advocating that, our policymakers start to just give them a heads up on things so that they can prep and be ready for what's coming down the pipeline.
Sure. One thing we talked about in our breakout room was, thinking about when to strategically maybe have meetings in person versus or hybrid versus totally remote as public health things change and that becomes more popular with members of the public, and really thinking through how do you make that engagement in person really valuable, and really what does it mean to have your regular business be remote, but really coming together in a different way altogether.
Great, thank you. And I believe there was maybe two more breakouts or one more breakout.
I can share, Emily. I think the big theme that we talked about was not just, whether or not we can have policy that allows for a hybrid meeting in the first place, but also the how of that process, the details, for example, whether or not chat is included in those open meeting law requirements. What does capacity look like? What are capacity expectations? And how are we building capacity amongst staff, or just creating more space for there to be staff in order to have more capacity? So thinking about those different layers, in addition to whether or not we could even have this be a long-term way of doing local government.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. So we would like to spend the rest of the time with Leah and Lauren and trying to see if we can answer any more questions that have come about, or, you know, even if there's questions or comments that you wanted to still raise. So one of the questions that came in that I wanted to see if Leah, Lauren, you could speak a little bit more about. I think there was a question on just specifically, can you talk more about what a quorum of the body is? So we definitely want this session to be accessible. And what is the quorum of the body?
Certainly. So a quorum is more than half of the number of members the committee should have. So if it's a 5-member committee and there's one person doesn't come and another person at the last minute says no, you still have 3 people, that's a quorum. If the committee only had 2 people appointed, however, out of 5, that is not a quorum and they cannot meet for the purpose of conducting business. We typically recommend that if you arrive at a meeting and you're a board member and there's less than a quorum of the board present, that you don't stay and chat with the people who've arrived for the meeting. Instead, you indicate that you'll try to reschedule and get back. And especially in public hearing context, every decision is supposed to be made on information in the record, and it can be challenged as kind of a lack of due process if the board members who are there received information that the rest of the board didn't. So there are a few exceptions, just to make sure that people know. You will see in city charters sometimes it will say what a quorum is, and it could be more than 1/2 of one quorum. So it could be in a 9-member council. It could say you have to have 7 present in order to have a quorum. Under the Wetlands Protection Act, there is specific language that says for conservation commissions working under that act, so just the State Wetlands Protection Act, they're able to meet regardless of whether it's a quorum of the entire body. Instead, it's a quorum of those who are appointed. So it reduces that to allow conservation commissions to continue to protect the environment, even if there are vacancies. Charters could also do the same thing. They would have to be adopted through a special act because the open meeting law specifically defines the word quorum.
Thank you for that. Now I have a really interesting question for you. Do you see text messages as being part of the future of open meeting law? So using text messages.
Well, funny you should ask, because I thought that was something that's worthy of talking about. I think one of the things I mentioned earlier was that the law has a really hard time catching up with technology. You know, it's funny, we're talking about Zoom meetings. I'm going to get back to that, I promise. Zoom meetings, but the next kind of big thing that's coming is the ability to have a virtual meeting room where you sit at a chair, at a table, or in the audience at a meeting. And so it recreates that feeling. Maybe we say, oh, okay, well, that's still just a virtual meeting, but is it? And what about the hybrid scenario in those circumstances? So in some ways, I think the law waits until it has to change. I said earlier, open meeting law changed in 2010. I still find that people are surprised to hear about the new definitions that Leah went over and the specific exceptions that were created during COVID. Public records law, same exact thing. there were no changes to the public records law for hundreds of years. I'm kidding. For a really long time. And that's because it's a really tricky topic. This state as a whole, and cities and towns in particular, were getting a lot of challenges from the media that they weren't being responsive enough. They, you know, the complaints weren't being processed. There was no, so the legislature finally did act, and it created a more stringent public records law. It both the public records law and the open meeting law essentially say any type of gathering. It doesn't say in person by text, or it does say by email, because that's something they included. But to violate the open meeting law, if you have a 5-member board and we are 3 of the members, all that has to happen is I call Emily. Emily's like, thanks for, you know, sharing your opinion with me. She gets on with Leah and she said, well, Lauren thinks this is a horrible idea. Violation of the open meeting law. So I would say if you have a text chain, a text chat, like a group chat, that yes, if it's a quorum of members, it is likely to violate the open meeting law. Texts, even under the public records law, are likely public. It is, and I say that with all due respect to all of you who just started shaking, but it is really difficult to get along in this world without using those tools. So bottom line is, I personally try not to send texts to clients that are substantive in nature, because the public records law says the chit-chatty ones don't have to be maintained. You know, let's meet at 7. I'm going to be late, which is my normal thing I have to text about. So that's under the public records law. Under the open meeting law, the standard is just, did it reach a quorum? And so we're seeing lots of public records requests for texts and lots of open meeting law complaints for serial communications. And, you know, that I attribute that thought to the way texts are handled. I typically say, if you are a board or committee member, or your staff are a board or committee member, it is just a better practice not to use an email or a text to talk about work things, because the chances someone else on your board or committee might hear it, and in that situation, an open meeting law violation has occurred. So I say stay away from it.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren. Yes, definitely had a moment of, ooh, I use text messages. Thank you for that. So Leah, in your presentation, you mentioned the Attorney General's office. There's a question here, you know, would the Attorney General engage us, all of us, I guess, in the process of figuring out what the future policy will look like? I also look to Lauren, because I think about 10 years ago, maybe, you said you were part of updating some of open meeting law. So look to both of you, either would the Attorney General look to us, or how would we sort of participate in an update process?
I think that's a really great question, and it's one that I haven't gotten into with her office, so I'll bring it back. I will drop into the chat the link to the open meeting law educational materials that I mentioned earlier, just because I do want to make sure that folks see those, because I know there's a lot of information available on the web, and that has the newsletters and a lot of that past information. So I'll drop that there.
My impression is, again, this law is changed and policy is developed when it has to be. That's when we see the action. So if you all want to be a part of that, it's something you should talk about at MAPC. You should talk about it at your associations. You should talk about it with the MMA, and you should talk about it with your state senator or state representative. It is unlikely, in my opinion, that they would create a new law and not put it out first for some sort of review. It would be released. It would be in a committee for a hearing. That's another opportunity to weigh in. But the best time, obviously, is before it happens. So when the Attorney General issues regulations, they're required to have a comment period, and they do. So that would be what you try to pay attention to on those circumstances. But I think this is part of the same discussion we were having. It's hard to implement the rules that state law provide, and everyone's goal is the same. We work for municipalities or state entities. We're looking to, to do good, right? To do the right thing. And so I don't, I always say, I don't think anyone means to do things incorrectly, but it happens all the time. So I would, if you're frustrated with that, and I'm not saying that you are, that's something you should tell the state rep and the state senator. It's hard to implement these in a consistent way, especially with volunteers who are not used to the public sector.
Great. I have one more specific question that I think is in the Attorney General's guidance, but someone did bring it up, which is when you're working with your boards and commissions or your city council, your select board, and you are doing a virtual meeting, I think there's a question on what happens when someone wants to be off camera during those meetings or during when decisions get made. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is there a requirement that everyone has to be on camera?
That's correct. If the person has the ability to use their camera, so you put your camera on and then you turn it off during the meeting. If you're a board or committee member, you are not supposed to do that. You're supposed to leave your camera on for the entire time. I know one community where when someone wants to kind of step down from their official position, they'll say, I'm going to recuse myself from this discussion, and they will close their camera for that. And I think that's okay. This is one of those practical problems that is addressed on a case-by-case basis. And basically, if you start from the position that the open meeting law is trying to bring in to the public, arena as much as possible, and you think about that from a common sense perspective, and I don't mean a lawyer, you just think about it. Am I being more or less transparent? If the answer is less, the open meeting law probably doesn't like it. So that's, just kind of a gut reaction to how you deal with those things on a case-by-case basis.
Awesome. I will be thinking about that always when I have my little Lauren on my shoulder, using the common sense method here. I do have a question to change gears on interpretation and translation. So I think we talked about accessibility issues, and there was a comment around the issue of translation into various languages, including using closed captioning or other tools for deaf and blind folks that are deaf or blind. So the question, though, is how should we address translation and interpretation issues into different languages in these mediums? I know when we had our focus group, one of our city councilors definitely brought this up.
Yeah, I think those are really important questions. I don't think there's a single answer. What you're statutorily required to do is different than what you may want to do. Under the ADA, essentially, you're supposed to make reasonable accommodations so that individuals, who have mobility impairments or hearing impairment have the ability to participate. And under the open meeting law, participation means attend, and that's it. So to be able to attend meetings and know what's going on. So in the case where someone comes to you, 5 days before and says, I only speak blah, 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 I have limited hearing or whatever, you can look into it. Who's available? Is there a program? What has the MAPC been recommending? Let me shoot something out on my listserv to the managers or administrators I talk to. So that's one option. And for that, if someone tells you 5 minutes before, it's not reasonable if you can't just do it. So it's a timing thing. It's whether it changes the program. and again, I think that's why a lot of in-person meetings, there's been kind of a move towards having a sign language person present. Especially you see at all of the governor's press conferences, and there's always a sign language interpreter, and it avoids having to think about whether this is an accessible meeting, whether someone might need assistance. And so, I always say being proactive is great. You want to consider, though, if you're going to be providing a translation, let's say in Spanish, and you live in a community that for purposes of the National Voter Registration Act, you have to provide ballots in a few languages. I wouldn't say just doing Spanish would be enough. You'd have to do Spanish and Chinese and Khmer, So often good intentions are hard to implement in this area. I would definitely talk to the ADA coordinator in your city or town, and also to maybe to the disability committee itself. They may have ideas about making the process more accessible to people with limitations.
Great. Thank you. I think we have 2 more minutes. So we have some questions on capacity, and I invite people to actually answer this in the chat from the audience, but there is a question around capacity for staff. Do you know of any opportunities for training that exists for staff broadly? Leah or Lauren, if you know of any sort of trainings or resources for capacity building for staff, I would love to hear it. Otherwise, if you're in the audience, please pipe in the chat. Leah?
I always look to the community engagement team to tell me how to learn new skills. Emily, you and your team have been really helpful in making sure that I feel like I know some of the different opportunities available. I'll see if I can, I know I've seen other agencies, I just can't remember them off the top of my head. I will do some digging and share back.
Very sorry, Emily, that my dogs are also weighing in here, but I think the opportunity also exists kind of in perhaps a slower way, and that might be working with a chief information officer and trying to figure out whether the jobs that staff have been doing are really too big now that there are these other manners of conducting business, and taking a good look at who's handling what administrative work, and who's handling community outreach, et cetera, would be a good step.
Excellent. And I will selfishly do a plug. So our community engagement staff has done many trainings for staff. We are a regional planning agency, so cities and towns can kind of hire us outright. We also have technical assistance funds. So if you are looking to apply at the beginning of the year, you can definitely put in an application for technical assistance for MAPC to do community engagement trainings or staff trainings as well. So it's something to consider. There was a question around examples of introductory comments that can be made at the beginning of a Zoom or a hybrid meeting. Actually, we have a lot of materials that we're going to post of all the things that we've learned over the past few months in December. So we do have a toolkit. And right now we actually do have a virtual engagement toolkit on MAPC's website. So if one of my staff members could put that link in the chat, that would be great. And that is a resource that is open and available to you. Leah, did you want to say something? Okay. All right. And then I guess the last question here is a very specific question. Maybe Lauren, you mentioned this before. Do you know which towns have initiated a special act for remote participation, or is that information that you can share with us that we can share back out?
Sorry about the motion that was going on there. So I do know some that are very interested in doing that. I think Brookline had requested special legislation for that purpose, or was going to. Oh, there's just, it just left my mind. There are examples out there. If you go onto the General Court's website, you can actually search through bills, and there's a number of resources. Maybe Lexington I think there's a few others. We typically do e-updates is what we call them, where we kind of look at new emerging issues and have some general thoughts to share. And we will definitely be doing one about that. So you can check back and, you know, you can contact me directly, or you can go to our website and tell the computer that you'd like to be on the list for distribution. That's another option.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, I want to close out. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I have one question for the audience before you sign off. Can you please let us know, of all the things that you've heard, whether this is the first workshop that you've been to on hybrid engagement, or if you've been to all 4, of all the topics that we've brought to light, which ones would you like us to prioritize? Our project sort of research ends in December, but there's certainly so much more to go into, whether it's, you know, policies on the internal municipal level, whether it's state policies, whether it's how to use investments that are coming up for technology, whether it's around equity and translation interpretation, whatever it is, it can be specific. Yeah, please tell us if there's something that popped up today that you think we should be researching and getting more information on. So I'll give you a moment here to add that into the chat. What is you know, the topic around hybrid engagement that you would like us to prioritize, look more into, find more resources on? So I'll let you populate the chat there. And then finally, I just want to thank Lauren so much for your comments and your time. Leah, thank you so much for doing all of that, you know, representing all of those dates and bills in real detail. Thank you to the whole community engagement team and also to our partners. It's been a wonderful effort, and I really hope that we can kick something off like this again in the new year. Thank you everyone for joining today, and hopefully you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Thanks, Lauren and Leah, and now you can let your dogs bark into the afternoon.
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be able to participate, and I appreciate that your group is doing so much work with, you know, diving deeper into things that that really you could just skim across the top. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.
Awesome.
Lots to come.
Lots more to come. This is just the beginning, I'm sure. I'm going to let everyone be able to put their comments into the chat. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Feel free to come off mute.
I love when everyone says hi at the end. So.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to see you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. Good one.
Right. All right, Yolanda, I think we're good.
All right, bye, y'all.
You really did come join us.
Oh, nice. Awesome.
You saving the chat, Yolanda?
Yeah, I could do that.